The Eroica, Wagner, and Form in the Dionysiac. Abstract and seminar paper by Sean McHugh. Romanticism Conference at National Chengchi University, Taiwan, November 2016. Abstract. All argue from Beethoven's influential Eroica Symphony, 1803, that the romantic development in music of evolving form expands rather than closes down critical space provided by the classical period's intellectual transparency in that form, as well as content, becomes aestheticized. The Eroica and later Beethoven works destabilize previous structures in creating direction of movement and overall form based on characteristics of their initial material. They indicated the wide-ranging visceral expression still latent in music to be explored across Romanticism and beyond. Romantic Dionysian response consists in immanent relations beneath and not amenable to Apollonian foregrounding and perspicuity, but which are distinct from persuasion without good reason or capitulation from searching for authentic expression. Truth in art issues from subjectively perceived but universalizable and immediate aesthetic experience rather than interminable dialectics and subject to object or scientific relations, where shifting formal frames and rationale in art and society relativize and consign truth to unreachable future utopias. My research suggests that the peak of Romanticism in Wagner, where uncertainty on the intellectual level combining paradoxically with conviction and inevitability, compares with the early 20th century challenge to the epistemological tradition and its search for conceptual certainty in knowledge. The end results of Husserl's phenomenology and concern for direct experience over theorizing imply that knowledge is grounded only because the world is perceived to be there, and that second-order attempts at verification of perceptions are misplaced. Neither formal frames in art nor presuppositions of the reasoning mind need be assumed or justified for access to truth. Carnal love at the heart of life exemplifies emotional immediacy and sensory contact over distanced reflection and classical objectivity. Its accurate depiction in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, 1859, then involves motivic combinations that undermine regular content to form relations and disorientate rational account. Romantic art and love dissolve intellectually defined critical distance to indicate knowledge as structured within, rather than entirely separate to the subject. By contrast, Bizet's Carmen, 1874, with its decorous conceptual framing and closed melodies that try to keep the subject distinct from love and wider experience, and which Wagner's critic Nietzsche lauded over Tristan and Romanticism, indicates the inauthenticity and repression of reasoning taken as fundamental. The Eroica, Wagner, and Form in the Dionysiac. Romantic music is characterized by evolving and rhapsodic form that can be aesthetically meaningful alongside content, and hence expands rather than closes down the critical space issuing from play of material within classical and other previous periods' pre-given symmetries and outward balance. It has been criticized for its lack of intellectual transparency and treated with suspicion, yet achieves results of great artistic unity through immanent rather than externally imposed relations, where the contents or initial materials' subtle characteristics are used to define overall development. Evolving form explores unforeseen and, in classical terms, disquieting depths in the listener's visceral or Dionysian response, beyond traditional distanced reflection. However, conscious understanding, as given by immediate intuition, and only secondarily subject to intellectual or Apollonian sense-making, makes the emotions a primary and authentic expression of truth. The downgrading of reasoned formal account in the experience need not mean the work is reducible to arbitrary and dubious persuasion by the artist's personality and goals, and moreover, art with subtle rather than perspicuous levels of unity parallels the holistic interconnection in life. Ludwig van Beethoven's Symphony No. 3, Eroica, of 1803, is among the key works in early musical Romanticism and consolidates his heroic middle period style with a deepened expressive range and zeal. It was the longest and most complex symphony then written, and involves short motifs not built into closed themes, and instead used to dissolve sectional sonata form and allow expansion. Foreground and background elements merge, create an all-inclusive and unschematic unity where form as well as content is specific to the work. A constantly focused homogeneity displaces heterogeneity to provide a battleground of issues of great internal cohesion and with the sense of triumph already secured. Many conventions are revealed as dispensable and overpowered with former pivotal points of architectonic balance, dialectics, and argumentation, diffused and undermined. Vigorous exchanges of energy displace grace, propriety, and intellectually defined teleology and satisfaction. The formal shape articulates and justifies itself instead only as it emerges, its linear fragmentation relating neither to renunciation of conceptual thought nor to uncontrolled emotions, but to a logic dependent on the material. Movement within and outside framework, determinate structures, and fixed principles is negated by the motif's own references to each other. Beauty then gives way to fervor, resilience, and striving, and hence to a sense of higher edifying values and human spirit. Moreover, there are parallels between the Eroica's vigor and Beethoven's personal resolve in respect of his hearing loss at this time. Form by web of motifs is then developed further by Richard Wagner, the foremost figure in late Romantic music, who studied and conducted many Beethoven works, where all closure and cadence are replaced by an ongoing inner form based on inherent dynamic tendency. A systematic association for every component of the texture is developed, such that each part connotes the extrapolation of all others. Sequences emerge and submerge, but in contexts where again all achievements are already secured by a visionary mind. The attention diffusing across myriad levels of interconnected detail also blurs the moment in parallel with consciousness constantly referring backwards and forwards. The initial musical material defining form in Wagner also remains unstated in the background, so that there are only variations of motifs and not originals, and compares with truth being unforegroundable, for instance in the background idea of a perfect circle that is only reflected in imperfect real-world circles. Arguing for truth beneath traditional conceptually defined or linear form is problematic, however, as argumentation is conceptual and linear, and thus implicitly undermines itself. Yet, repetition of motifs takes the attention self-referentially inward into the material's aesthetic content, rather than meaning being derived through reference to an external form. The iterations indeed become ecstatic, despite their redundancy on the informational level, a process explored further by 20th century minimalism. Friedrich Nietzsche, although for a time a close friend and supporter of Wagner, is among those arguing that the music's claims to great structural feats, in the absence of pre-given form, are false, and listeners are persuaded without it being clear what they're persuaded of. He sees such romanticism as fogging the mind, providing inauthentic consolation, and hence in fact not being expressive of the fundamental Dionysiac. However, the parallel attempt in culture to reconcile reality's all-inclusive nature by means of exclusive conceptual frameworks is the real deception. Only an infinity of possibility in an outwardly unarticulated or pre-rational logic can offer integrity. And evolving form still provides a core of stillness out of its material's given potentials, and thus an internal critical distance in the midst of emotional engagement. Wagner and Romanticism are amenable to intuition and faith rather than conventional analyses, and lead earlier reflective art and thought, in terms of distanced observer to artwork or subject-to-object relations, back towards a more immediate engagement with lived life. In place of the elegant and decorous, there is immediate instinctual and righteous involvement within global contexts. Material plays within formal play, in parallel with thought playing within complete freedom, rather than material playing only within an artificially stable form, in parallel with thought playing only within a culture of paradigms and unverified presuppositions, dependent on interminable revision and regression that never find truth. We can't separate ourselves from ourselves. So the self and the Dionysiac as objects for self-reflection must be addressed from within them, and not from without in terms of preconceived and hence alienating and inauthentic framing. Wagner's music levitates above the crutches of structural pillars, landmarks, and other intellectually reassuring contrivance, and paradoxically finds better grounds. It is unpredictable from moment to moment, yet has enormous inevitability and conviction out of the moment's reference to the wider, holistic, yet goal-oriented context. The great Western art tradition is a response to alienation from rising rationality and displacement of spirituality on the cultural level, particularly in the modern period, with its scientific and industrial revolutions. Diego Velázquez's masterpiece painting, The Maids of Honor, from the start of modernity, features Spanish royalty at the height of wealth and living standards, yet the young princess at the center has a distracted, doll-like frozen posture and glazed-over demeanor, with concerned maids about her, but sharing the strangeness. Their chocolate box existence is unsatisfying and demands something more. Truth is hidden imminently behind the surface of material life, but the new culture has instead taken it to be that surface. The confused perspective of the mind as basically conceptual rather than aesthetic is then expressed in Western philosophy's central project of epistemology, likewise developed in the early 17th century and extending to the present, as the attempt to find intellectually transparent or propositional grounds to knowledge or truth. Its abject failure gives support instead to the intuitive grounds recognized by Romanticism. René Descartes began the project with "I think, I am," in an attempt to eliminate the regress of justifying premises and locate certainty in conceptual thinking itself. However, the assumption of an inner subject relating to an outer objective world, and hence the need for a theory explaining sensory connection between them, is unjustified and a product of his culture now prioritizing demarcation and articulation. Indeed, after 300 years in the early 20th century, epistemology met serious objections, even in its own terms, particularly with the end results of phenomenology, or attention to outward experience over theorizing, of Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. These indicate that knowledge is commonsensically grounded because the world is perceived to be there, and that second-order attempts to verify perceptions of it are misplaced. Neither presuppositions of the reasoning mind in a theory, nor likewise formal frames in art, need be assumed or justified for access to truth. Rather, the mind has a pre-linguistic intuitive connection with reality that may only subsequently be given to rationale and explanation. Indeed, rationale means of ratios, where the attempt is to understand reality only in terms of other things in a relativist framework. Consciousness, as comprising the basis of both subjectivity and objectivity, provides for our immediate and aesthetic rather than reasoned and framed relations with reality. The subject-object distinction, moreover, is undermined in quantum mechanics, the overarching model for modern physics. A monistic ontology further aligns with Socrates' insight on knowledge at the start of Western civilization, where if knowledge wasn't already structured within us, we couldn't recognize it. Unconscious computers, by contrast, can't gain knowledge because the syntax of formal symbol manipulation isn't transcended into semantics, and moreover, top chess players state that they understand situations on the board in a holistic way that machines don't, despite the rational thought involved. The Greeks also understood the mind's dual nature of the primary intuition plus subservient intellect, and deified them as Dionysius and Apollo. Wagner and Nietzsche, in his earlier thought, are key figures in their modern explication, with the union of mind in Wagner's works making them the center of the empire of Western art and some of the civilization's greatest achievements. Looking beyond the West, Indian or Hindu philosophy, particularly its classic Advaita Vedanta position, similarly argues for all things as expressions of the same background, and hence a subject-to-subject relation with the world, where reality is already included within consciousness. There is no separation, framing, or epistemological gaps to bridge between inner and outer, and instead only an interface between consciousness and wider relativity, provided by the Dionysiac, with its own organizing intelligence. The world's foundation isn't subject to description by relative conceptual relations, as these objectify it as separate to us when we are part of it. Instead, we can only be it aesthetically. The principal Bhagavad Gita text concerns uniting the relative intellect with absolute truth, where God shakes Arjuna out of his uncertainty, issuing from a neurotically rational assessment of his situation to realize his own divinity. The Nara-Narayana pair of deities similarly expresses God and the human condition as twin brothers. Meanwhile, Hindu dharma, or right thought and action, dependent only on particular circumstances, parallels context-dependent rather than principle-dependent motivic working. The Western academic process, however, as concerned with theoretical interpretation, provides a long-standing critique of Romanticism and Wagner, seeing emotional response in aesthetic experience not as fundamental, but distrustful. And consequently, academia selects for few, if any, music academics who are serious art music listeners, familiar even with the core repertory. Art music has a required familiarization or internalization process in order to access its aesthetic content, its actual meaning and purpose, consisting in repeated listening. The process compares with language learning, where English speakers, for example, may know what the outward sound of other languages they don't speak is like, but don't know what English sounds like because they never hear it, and instead always only hear its instant and mysterious translation into meaning. Art music is similarly totally transformed in one of life's greatest experiences, but most academics remain lost in book learning, as completely opposed to art's pre-rational nature. The aesthetic is subjectively experienced, but universalizable and verifiable, yet no such observational checks are admitted as evidence, and instead there are only detached sky castle conceptual frameworks and paradigms. Academics don't get to know the music, and hence literally don't know what they're talking about, while the community of serious listeners understands that questioning Wagner's basic achievements, for example, is thoroughly ignorant and benighted. Mathematics or geography may be the same thing as the study of mathematics or geography, but music is not the same as the study of music, and is instead an immediate experience of sound in the air. In a related way, swimming or driving can't be learned from intellectual study. Romantic love, with its subject-subject and for-itself relation, dissolving the apparent subject-object and for-other relation, parallels romantic art's dissolving of the critical distance of formal framing. Western culture, however, with its prioritization of rational or instrumental relations, then represses sexuality, all as it does romanticism in academia. This is despite sexuality being people's origins and the nature of courtship or seduction being aesthetic and unforegroundable, moving forward under subconceptual imperatives, where the woman may accept what action the man takes, but never agrees to anything. As with motivic working, the action is self-justifying only from moment to moment, while asking destroys the situation's dynamics. By contrast, the Indian tradition again understands sexual activity as expressive of the self-referential nature of consciousness and has temples to some of the highest gods covered in its depiction. The Apollonian mind is subsumed under the Dionysian, in contrast with the West's mistrust of the senses in aesthetics, epistemology, and religion. More authentic artistic depictions of sexual desire are exampled by Wagner's Tristan und Isolde of 1859, and more problematic by Georges Bizet's Carmen of 1874. The Dionysiac overwhelms reasoned reflection, and hence Bizet's traditional, understandable framework of contained sections is completely inadequate. Love and sex can't be objectified or reconciled at a distance, so that they become light, limpid, and courteous, as Nietzsche in his post-Wagner period wants, but are in their essence intoxicating and heady, with any attempt to separate them from us being wrong-headed and repressive. The lack of situating frameworks for romanticism and sex doesn't make them baseless or impossible to deal with, but instead indicates that all aesthetic experience is Dionysian, and only given falsely by respectable Apollonian framing. Tristan's form, by intuitive motivic web, indeed allows for its extraordinary inward descent into sexual psychology and progressive crushing of foregrounded thought taken as the mind's basis. Tristan's and Isolde's love is unaffected by their reproachful and ordering society, while by contrast, the affected state of mind of Carmen's suitor, Jose, thinking too much and not at one with himself, assures his failure with her. Nietzsche, without a love partner, tries to argue that the music of Tristan presses with 100 atmospheres and sweats and is stifling, breathless, and paroxysmal, and therefore has something wrong with it. But all these things are integral to sex and its complete legitimacy. He praises Carmen for its civility and politeness, but which on the contrary is dishonest and oppressive, there instead being something wrong with intellectualized wider Western culture, as he originally outlined in first book written under Wagner's influence. Here is the last half-minute of one of the two main sex scenes in Tristan, where the Dionysiac spills over, but is then interrupted, in the Leonard Bernstein recording with Peter Hoffmann and Hildegard Behrens of 1986. The emotional depiction is direct and accurate, bringing the listener in, rather than reflective. However, the artwork that takes Romanticism and its issuing of truth via the intuition and Dionysiac to its logical conclusion is Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring of 1913, forming the 20th century's keystone art music work. Again, motifs and material are juxtaposed with the attention located in the moment and not led astray by architectonic bridges to elsewhere. Yet, as in Beethoven and Wagner, the underlying interconnection brings colossal onward flow, along with primal power and savagery. Music's fundamentals of diatonic and chromatic harmony and duple and triple meters are combined together in intense asymmetry, then iterated in a blood-on-the-wall orgy of lust and violence. There is wholeness, overabundance, ruthlessness, extreme ecstatic statements, and horrific fascination, yet nothing out of proportion due to the inner control and alignment with subsurface dynamics, and accordingly with life's basic immediacy over abstracted calculation. The rite provides neither moderating formal frames nor chaos, but a return to the mind's nature and flow. The entire Western tradition of fake propriety is crushed beneath an unrelenting dissonance and rhythmic drive. As with sex and seduction, the rite's hurricane has an unflinching eye of stillness within its own terms to dispel delusory, self-conscious separation from the world. The audience at the first performance rioted because the music insulted their social norms and phony self-identity, but thereby provided their own fiasco in revealing in them exactly the music's Dionysian spirit they claim to oppose and not be fundamentally defined by. The rite destroys the tonality and structuring that persisted throughout the 300-year modern period, but again leads back to real life and not onto attempts at post-tonal harmony as were taking place elsewhere at the time. As in Romanticism and Wagner, it looks to a more authentic pre-modern society better aligned with human nature and community than alienating wider modernity with its compensation by art. It also uses folk music. The rite unifies art and life through dismantling of structural conceits and absorbing the listener. One of the rite's greatest recordings is the Igor Markovich of 1962. We'll hear half a minute towards the end, where a deeper logic is found through destructive, sexualized torrents, deliberately obliterating the last traces of Apollonian control. Emotions are legitimately raised as a result of form issuing out of continuity with aesthetic content. Finally, there is a long tradition across the arts and mythology of relative intellectual deliberation, abstracted from reality, being transcended to, or at least contrasted with, absolute intuition, direct common sense, and truth. Other examples in opera include Mozart's The Magic Flute of 1791, where a youth is lost in the distant land of his thinking, pursued by a serpent, or his sexuality, and has to pass trials to secure his girl. Wagner's Parsifal of 1882, where a youth is enlightened through a kiss to restore a religious order. Tchaikovsky's Iolanta of 1892, where a blind princess gains her sight with her first lover, and Straff's Ariadne auf Naxos of 1916, where a girl misguidedly thinks love is difficult, and the Roman version of Dionysus finds his divine nature through consummating his relationship with her. Examples with darker outcomes include Mozart's Così fan tutte of 1790, where lovers quickly change allegiance despite their contrary outward rationale, and in literature, Ovid's Pyramus and Thisbe of the 1st century BCE, and twice used in Shakespeare, where prospective lovers lost in false difficulties never meet properly. Shakespeare's Hamlet of 1602, where a man fails to transcend his rational deliberations for action. Measure sur Measure of 1603, where rules about sexuality again make no difference to it. And Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde of 1886, where a man takes a potion to rid himself of what he assumes to be his secondary, darker nature, but finds that it's his primary state. Film includes Forbidden Planet of 1956, where an ancient alien civilization reached extraordinary technological heights to build a machine to create anything at will from the mind, but found that it projected direct from the repressed Dionysiac and not from the superficial intellect as they assumed, with monstrous entities then appearing that destroyed them. It's based on Shakespeare's The Tempest of 1611, and its Nietzschean protagonist's confusion and struggles of mind. Then there is The Wicker Man of 1973, where the rite of spring narrative is used for a fool who never sees the light and is sacrificed. The Devils of 1971, where a priest's principled thinking causes his similar Dionysian execution. And Apocalypse Now Redux of 2001, based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness of 1899, where again an intelligent man fails to make sense of the limits of rational judgment. Examples in myth include Orpheus and Eurydice of the 6th century BCE, where a man loses a woman because he looks to her in terms of subject-object reconciliation, instead of stepping forward. The Frog Prince of the 13th century, where a youth as a talking frog, not seeing how to proceed, persuades a girl to kiss or sleep with him to realize his real nature. And further, there is Beauty and the Beast of the 18th century, where a man is similarly transformed. The Sorcerer's Apprentice of 1797, but again originating in the ancient world, where a deluge to drown in from phallic broomsticks created by an apprentice is only sorted out by a master. And the Chinese, the Butterfly Lovers of the 9th century, where a youth fails to see the real dynamics of his relationship with a girl because they can't be foregrounded. There are numerous other examples in the Indian tradition, including the Nataraja image, where Shiva dances over a demon of ignorance, circumscribed by a ring of fire, all as the liberated mind or self-referral consciousness is kept secure within itself and away from the groundlessness of thinking per se. And finally, the goddess Chinnamasta resides over Kama and his consort Rati making love, where she's cut off her own head and holds it in one hand, with blood fed to it and her attendant deities. The energy from the couple is an awakening beyond even the god's comprehension, and it blows Chinnamasta's rational head off. Meanwhile, dogs eat the severed heads of men lying around, reflecting the comprehensive passing away of relational Apollonian thought in personal development. Sexuality and the Dionysiac are on the level of truth and far from the intellectual reconciliation of later Nietzsche, Bizet, and Western thought. All done. Any questions?